we're at a place where we know a lot about the problems, but what we need more work on are solutions to those problems. One of the things I'm most proud about in this work is that we identify a solution, a practical, actionable solution that we can start to make a difference in people's lives.
Welcome to The Ripple Effect, the podcast that takes you on a journey through the minds of Wharton faculty. I'm your host, Dan Loney, and in each episode, we'll be diving deep into the inspiration behind the groundbreaking research that Wharton professors have conducted and exploring how their findings resonate with the world today. We'll be covering a diverse range of topics, bringing you the latest insights and knowledge that you can apply to your life and to work. So get ready to dive into new ideas with The Ripple Effect. So Nancy, you've done a lot of research on gender in the workplace. How did it come about that the topic of female moral objectors ended up on your radar?
Well, Dan, I've done a lot of work, as you said, over the years on both gender and on voicing issues in organizations. In fact, actually, my first academic publication was called Out on a Limb. And it was about women who were raising gender equity issues in their organizations and what made them more willing to do so. And we found that the role that they were in actually conferred legitimacy for raising these issues. So being in HR made women more willing to raise gender equity issues because they felt like that was part of their role. And what happened was my student and co-author, flash forward to 2020, my student and co-author, Tim, was interested in morality in organizations. And when he came to talk to me about this project, it was really a fabulous intersection of our interests, my interests on gender and voice, and his on moral objection.
And so you also found out that women in power are more likely to face retaliation when they voice ethical concerns more so than men in power. Can you break down that finding and what you believe accounts for the difference here?
Sure. As you said, we found that high-powered women, when they raised ethical concerns, experience more retaliation than their male counterparts. And the reason that we found for this is that they were perceived as being out of control. And what was really interesting about this for us is that a lot of the past research on gender assumes that one of the reasons that women get backlash is because they're perceived as not warm and friendly. But we found actually it wasn't warmth perceptions that was the problem. It was self-control. And the reason for that is, frankly, people don't like moral objectors. They whether they're male or female, people think that moral objectors are seen as rocking the boat, as violating expectations, as disrupting things. And one of the things that's really interesting is that people think that moral objectors are often selfish, actually. It's kind of interesting. They feel like they're selfishly demonstrating their own moral superiority or, putting their own ideological preferences onto other people or the organization in this case. And, actually, a lot of the literature talks about how moral objectors are sometimes viewed as self-righteous or arrogant. And the perception is exacerbated by the idea that it's somehow seen as morally inappropriate or socially inappropriate that you're raising these objections, right? You're disrupting things. You're making waves. And so when moral objectors violate expectations by raising these concerns, other people often think that they're doing this to advance their own moral agenda, and that there's something selfish about that that costs the group something.
So let's take a moment and talk about this idea of perceived self-control. What does it really mean in this context?
Yeah, so self-control is what we mean by self-control is that it's either the ability or the lack of self-control is the inability to restrain those selfish or antisocial impulses, right? For the sake of what's perceived as best for the group. So the kinds of things that we would ask is, does Dan lack self-discipline? Is Dan bad at resisting temptation? does Dan act without thinking through alternatives? And what we find is that lower self-control, we actually did some supplementary analyses where we find that lower self-control is associated with perceptions of self, more higher selfishness and lower other orientedness. So you're not as concerned about others if you're seen as having low self-control.
So there seem to be a variety of gender stereotypes at play here. Based on the work that you've done, what are some of the strongest ones that tend to influence how women are perceived in the workplace?
Yeah, that's a really important question, Dan. I think that some of the gender stereotypes that are really important when we think about women in the workplace are stereotypes around other orientedness, around communality, right? Are we doing things on behalf of the group? Are we pro-social? Are we are we in it for everyone? And that plays out here as well, in that it's related to perceptions of self-control. But what also you often see in many other uh, types of work on gender in the workplace are the perceptions of warmth, that women need to be warm and friendly. You've seen or you've heard about how women need to smile more, and that's sort of an expectation of women, that they are uh, more more connected to others in the workplace, and that's really very hard
Mhm.
oftentimes, because it's an additional layer of responsibility that women have to really engage with other people while they're having to be highly competent at their jobs at the same time. And so what we add in this paper is actually this additional expectation around self-control, uh, that plays out, I think, in important ways.
How does retaliation show up in this context as well? And can it tend to be subtle?
Yeah, so retaliation was the dependent variable we looked at. So we were looking at the consequences of raising moral concerns and how do people react to you. And retaliation was what we looked at. And retaliation can take a lot of different forms. It can be work related. You could be demoted, if it's at an extreme case. But it can also take less extreme forms, and social kind of norm types of functions, like people spreading gossip or rumors about the person or what have you. Um, it also is important because retaliation occurs when people want to either silence, discredit, or discourage people from behaving the way that they're behaving in the future, right? So it's
Mhm.
it's it's trying to maintain order and compliance in the face of a behavior that's seen as problematic. And so when we looked at retaliation in this paper and in this study, we looked at it in a couple of different ways. So we had a couple of studies where which were archival studies that were done in the field, and they asked people if they had experienced retaliation in a lot of different forms, right? So it
Mhm.
asked them about, did you, if you've ever experienced retaliation, because you raise health or safety concerns, right? Or you raised issues around fraud, or engage in any kind of whistleblowing, or whether you raise issues around equal opportunity, or some of the items were around whether people had raised issues around sexual harassment, or even disagreeing with management decisions, right? So it was even as broad as that.
Mhm.
And so in one of the studies, we looked at those types of issues. In some of the other studies, we asked people whether, so that study actually looked at whether you experienced retaliation. We turned it around in some of our other studies, and we asked people, have you ever retaliated against somebody else, right? And so in those studies, we asked things like, did you retaliate again? We gave them a scenario and we said, did you retaliate against that person? Or Did you suggest that they were out of line, or did you spread rumors, or did you discourage this behavior, or did you indicate that that behavior was inappropriate? So those were the types of ways that we operationalized retaliation in some of the other studies.
Can you walk us through the Kevin and Kate experiment?
Sure. So our fourth study in the paper that we published was, as you say, the Kevin and Kate experiment, where we gave participants a task where we asked them to brainstorm different ideas independently, and we could said they could use the internet to source ideas. And then they were supposed to interact with a set of teammates to develop the ideas. And what happened was, when they went to interact with the teammates, we had an artificial teammate, Kevin or Kate, and Kevin or Kate then was either a high power person or an average power person, and then we had Kevin or Kate say, either I must point out that a moral problem with this task, and I can't complete it. Asking users to use the internet to look up ideas could lead to plagiarism, and this is a serious moral issue and must be stopped. Right. So in one version, Kevin or Kate said that. In the other version, Kevin or Kate said, because it might come back to hurt the platform and any participants in the study, I have to point out there's a moral problem with the task and I can't complete it. Asking users to use the internet to look up ideas could lead to plagiarism, which could put people on the platform at risk. And this is a serious problem and might negatively impact the platform and the workers, or get us in trouble. And it has to be stopped in order to protect the platform and its workers from unfair retribution. So as you see, we had sort of a moral objection in both cases, but in the one case, it was sort of what we call the standard frame. And in the other case, it was what we call the organizational frame, where we're giving much more explanation and rationale about how it could hurt the organization and the people in the organization if we were to proceed with this problematic behavior, right? Yeah. And so what we then did is we had coders. We then had the participants who received Kevin or Kate's moral objection. We had them then respond to Kevin or Kate, and we coded their responses for whether they were retaliatory or not, right? And so retaliatory messages were ones where they ended up scolding or disparaging or criticizing Kevin or Kate for their behavior. And so, like, an example of one of our favorite quotes from the responses was, "You are a petulant little child. You need to grow up and get a grip." So that was an example of a negative retaliatory response. And then we coded positive responses. So some of the responses that the Kevin or Kate received were ones that thanked them or condoned their behavior. One of an example of that was, "This is a really important point, Kevin or Kate. Thanks for bringing it up." So, we had a variety of ways people responded based on who the person was, what their level of power was, and whether they used an organizational frame or not. And so that interaction between those factors really led to quite a disparity in how people responded.
And are there ways where you can even reduce the potential for retaliation in some of these circumstances?
Yeah. So one of the things that we found that was really important was when Kevin or Kate used the organizational frame, or where they kind of gave more of an explanation about the benefits to the organization and to the group, retaliation was lowered across the board for men and for women. The only people who did not experience higher levels of retaliation when they used a standard frame were the high-powered men. So the high-powered men were able to just do the sort of, this is wrong and we shouldn't do it, right? Lower-powered men and women and even high-powered women needed to use the organizational frame in order for them to experience lower levels of retaliation and be more accepted in terms of what they were saying.
What particular recommendations then would you have for organizations themselves around that type of a remedy?
So, Dan, I think it's really important that when we find things like this, that we don't put all of the burden on low-powered individuals, or in this case, certain groups of individuals like women. And so, our recommendations actually are more broad. So, what we would say is we encourage all moral objectors, regardless of their gender or structural power, to use an organizational frame when raising moral objections. It's going to make everybody sound more in control. And it is going to really help ensure that gendered outcomes are reduced. And it really increases people's receptivity to your moral objection, from, across all ends of the continuum. The
So,
second thing I would suggest is that we train people with how to do this. Right, we need to provide examples for employees with how to frame these types of moral objections, and to really, I guess, third is to help employees really recognize their own bias and learn to reframe moral objections that they encounter. Right, I mean, I think we need to raise awareness that we are all doing this. Men and women are doing this. Right, women were retaliating as much as men were against high-powered women when they were framing things in this way, right? Or not framing things with an organizational frame. And so, we really need to kind of raise that awareness to help with debiasing. And then I think that the last thing is just highlighting the benefits that moral objections can provide to organizations, because as I started with, people don't like moral objectors. They feel like they're rocking the boat. They feel like, this is just, they're a sticky wheel. And how do we make people understand that raising moral objections is not just about pursuing, a selfish agenda. It's often about pursuing a selfless agenda, and one that does benefit the organization as a whole.
So when you're thinking more broader scale, when it comes to correcting these types of imbalances, do you think it's better to focus on changing the system or changing the individual behavior?
Yeah, that's a really tough one, because I think that we have more leverage over individual behaviors often as individual actors, right? So, as a woman who is in a power position, it's important to know that this is a tool that you can use, right, to level the playing field. But again, I think that to make systemic change, we really need to do more, and we need to raise that awareness at a broader level. And so I think that it's both and, quite frankly.
So what are some of the other big questions that we need to look at right now around the topic of women in leadership?
So I actually think there's a really interesting opportunity here, Dan, because we're at a place in our scholarship where we know a lot about the problems. We've documented the problems: lack of representation, the leaky pipeline, the glass ceiling, the glass cliff, subtle forms of bias, benevolent sexism, lack of mentorship and sponsorship, right? Like, all of those are things that we know are problems. But what we need more work on are solutions to those problems. One of the things I'm most proud about in this work is that we identify a solution, a practical, actionable solution that we can start to make a difference in people's lives and their effectiveness in organizations. And so, more work that examines women's careers, more work that examines how we can get both men and women to be allies in addressing these types of issues. I think that those are the opportunities that we have to really make a difference in terms of women's leadership.
Nancy, thank you very much for your time today. All the best.
Thanks so much, Dan. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Ripple Effect. We hope you found this episode informative and engaging. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review so that we can continue to bring you the best insight from the Wharton School.